multilateral donor. We have a foundation in the Niger Delta that is a beneficiary of private giving, and it'll be interesting to see how that actually works. We have the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, which is one of the more respected think tanks that deals with issues of development and issues of development planning in Nigeria. And we have a development consultant that actually works with the people, works with the grassroots, has done a lot of work in the Southeast, engaging with the IPOB militants who have expressed certain discontent. And for me, a key aspect of what we would look at is what is bubbling underneath and how we can start to plan and prepare towards that. But before we go further, Ayaz from the World Bank has a very brief presentation to help set the scene. Ayaz.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you had good lunch. So, when I was talking to Dr. Yodi the other day, and she said it would be good to bring in a little experience from outside of Nigeria and try to relate the new way of working to that experience. So what I'm going to quickly do is to explain to you a little work that we have done together with partners in Somalia, and try to relate it to also the work that is being done in Nigeria vis-a-vis the new way of working. Can you just move the slide here? Just click it all, please. Yeah. So, let me start with Nigeria. So in Nigeria is the new way of working is already in a way started. It needs to really be scaled up, expanded, make it more functional. And there was a lot of talk in the morning about framework, and I think Debbie was saying that it's, the humanitarian actors already do have a coordinated framework, and we need to do the same for recovery. So what we have been trying to do under the leadership of the federal government through various partners at the state level is try to see how we can actually implement the findings of the recovery and peace building assessment that was done about 2 years ago as one basis, not the full basis, but as one basis for implementing a recovery program. So we do have a kind of a baseline of what needs to be done. Second, the humanitarian response plan, all of them contributing towards the Buhari plan and the economic recovery plan, and to see how we can start about actually implementing it. The problem is, in many cases, we do these assessments, but these assessments then, are not implemented in a coordinated fashion. So that's really what for me, the mutual accountability framework is. It's about it's about 5 things that we are doing for example, in the case of Somalia, and I'll come to that in a bit. So the Somalia case is about trying to implement a drought impact assessment that we did in Somalia, and it's a very, very fragile context. And it's about 5 things. It's about institutional framework for recovery. It's about the financing framework, prioritization and sequencing of recovery. It's about monitoring and evaluation of recovery, or in other words, performance management of recovery. But just to make a point that this is not a framework. This is a process of engagement, and that's exactly what I think ECC has now initiated. It's a process of engagement. So it's not going to be yet another beautiful book that is being written out, but actually a process through which we make things work. How do we make the institutional framework work? How do we build capacities? How do we provide an enabling policy framework for recovery? How do we actually set up an operational system for monitoring and evaluation so that we can do measure results jointly? So that's what really this is about. So in the case of the Somalia drought response, just to give an example, in 2017, January, Somalia was on the brink of famine. And, the World Bank would normally not engage in typically humanitarian response. But what is happening at the bank is that things are changing fast. There's a shift of paradigm to develop programs that can engage early in recovery. And that the Nigeria program that we have is also a manifestation of that same strategic shift to not wait for crisis to over. Because, the nature of crisis all over the world is changing. It's no longer about, two warring nations. It's about slow, protracted conflict that just keeps happening. And so we need to, there's no choice but to just start engaging as early as possible. And that's exactly what we did in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, one of the projects that myself and my colleague Mary are leading is called the Multi-Sector Crisis Recovery Project, which has elements of humanitarian response, early recovery, as well as medium-term recovery and resilience building. And for us, from the bank side, that's, in a way, a manifestation of how we are trying to adopt the new way of working into the way we develop projects, the way we develop programs. So in Somalia, just coming back, just to show how the new way of working has indeed worked to an extent in Somalia, we decided, and Somalia is a country to which we cannot lend because it's in a non-accrual status. So we had to find ways and means of doing that. So in the case of Somalia, where, like almost half the country was on the brink of famine, the bank decided to take a strategic decision to, have an exceptional IDA allocation from the crisis response window. We actually went about, and the operation was really designed around a mix of humanitarian and early recovery activities. So we ended up financing FAO, and we ended up, interestingly, financing ICRC. This is the first bank engagement. It's also called a project of first. The first time the bank has engaged with unconventional partners like the ICRC. And the result has been good. So what we have been able to achieve in the last in the last 1 year or so is that we had this $50 million project, which has fully dispersed in 1 year, and it has focused largely on providing support to FAO for various recovery and resilience building activities. At the same time, it has funded ICRC for mostly what you could term as humanitarian response. And what we have done is there was one element of it which was not covered because we could not engage the government directly in this project. So we have now also initiated what is called a recovery and resilience framework in Somalia, which is a process that is led totally by the government, and we are hoping and it's going to be presented in Brussels in a few days, so which is likely to now inform the national development process in a big manner. So once again, the recovery and resilience framework is a typical manifestation of implementing an assessment or a needs assessment which is not static in nature, which is dynamic in nature, and which is a process of engagement on 5 lines that I explained to you: institutions, financing, prioritization, monitoring and evaluation, and policy framework. And so for me, the experience from Somalia and the experience that we already have in Nigeria tells us that maybe that's really the way to go about doing it. But obviously, under the leadership of ECC, federal government, and others, I hope we'll find other ways of, adopting this kind of a framework approach to better suit the requirements of Northeast Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayaz. So we've seen from the Somalia example that a new approach can work and can deliver results. But let's wind back a little. SSG, sir, it's arguable that if someone had looked at some of the statistics in the Northeast 10 years ago, they could reasonably predict a crisis happening in the Northeast. What can we do differently?
Thank you very much. Before I comment, I want to recognize my colleague that we are here together. The Honorable Commissioner of Agriculture, stand up for recognition. He's behind the pillar there. So whatever I say, we should hold the two of us responsible if it is bad. Anyway, I think first of all, relevant to the Nexus approach, I think there are a number of layers that has to come together. First, we have a reasonable content of the international community activities. Then we have the federal government, we have the state governments, we have local government, we have NGOs, we have the academia and business. these layers are not working together to solve certain critical problems. If I refer to your question critically, it would have been natural for all the 6 states in the Northeast to say, for example, have some kind of documentation on their SWOT. What strengths do they have? What are their weaknesses? What are the opportunities they have? And what are the threats? So that these layers will now come together to work on them. That should have been things that we should have done. Then we would have seen these problems. The other thing on the other side is we have another group of 4 layers. We have the political layer, and when I was making comment on capacity building, everybody will speak about government, but actually it's politics. In this country, campaigning never stops. There is no difference between political activities and governance. It continues. I discovered this when I became the SSG, because I thought some of us who are technocrats, we've come into a team, now we will govern. We should know the problems, we should devise solutions, we should proceed. No, politics doesn't stop. And that politics require rejigging, rebooting through capacity building to understand that politics is about choosing leaders who knows problems to solve and then who have got ideas to solve them. But that's not the case. We have to do it differently. Secondly, economics. I think you can count on fingers of one hand the number of functional industries in the Northeast. Now, if that is true, then who is employing these young people? Where are the professionals going? We should have known this. In Adamawa, I think other than probably the Faro water bottling company and some few companies, there are no industries. So when you hear organized private sector coming and then trying to do things, you tend to wonder, where is that nexus? So again, we should have seen that unemployment is bound to be a continuous problem in that region. Thirdly, technical. We have to do things differently to be efficient. This is an agricultural zone. This is a zone also that has the driest part of the country in it. Therefore, we should have looked at this as the major employer of labor, as the major sustainer of life, to do things differently because we have to be efficient. And finally, the moral layer. The moral layer is key. I think the Northeast probably is the most vibrant when it comes to religious practices, to the extent that it is the firm religious movement that created Boko Haram that is causing challenges. But that's morality. So again, we should have done things differently by mopping up all these kind of activities to see where they are. Conclusively, for Adamawa State, at least I know, most people here, when you look at humanitarian, you think you're working on solutions for insurgency, or at least supporting insurgency. But in Adamawa State, we also have flooding problem. Every single year, the Cameroon will open their dam. That Lagdo Dam will flood nearly half of the state. That creates IDPs too. That kills animals too, sometimes people too. It has created more damage probably than Boko Haram. Third, communal clashes. Adamawa has 89 different tribes gazetted. And instead of agreeing between us to take our differences positively, we just fight, if you know what I mean. So we have a very fertile ground for communal clashes. And then the scourge of the farmers, herdsmen challenges. Yes, we have the largest number of cows per state in Nigeria. But instead of taking it industrially, we are now seeing challenges. So all these are things, when you overlap them, that you can actually see what you should have done differently. And I think that is a subject matter for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll skip Ayaz for now. I'll come back to you later. But Tunji, a lot of what the SSG described would be equally applicable in the Niger Delta. The issue of politics, the economics, the lack of industries, apart from those extracting oil, of course, and the attendant damage that extraction costs, the issues of technical capacity of the people, the issues of climate and its effect on the environment. All of these issues are present in the Niger Delta. There is peace in the Niger Delta now. Is there really peace in the Niger Delta now?
Thank you. Before now, before we had to face what's going on in the Northeast, the Niger Delta was in a similar situation in certain respects. But it became clear to some of the private sector players there that that could not be sustained if they were to continue to operate safely. And so folks like us were established by Chevron Corporation to look at things at a macro level and not just your traditional fence line relationships with the communities within your environment. A lot of what you said, as Joe has also asked, are similar, but there is peace. Depending on where you are. A lot of focus in the Delta is often on the oil-producing areas. And people tend to forget that there are a lot more communities that are non-oil producing and will still have to get on with their lives, even though they don't get as much attention as the others. Some people say rightly so, those ones need to because of the economic interests. But what became evident to us when we were established in 2010 was the oil industry could not keep everybody engaged. And there were a lot more opportunities that we weren't paying attention to. And so it was time to focus on those. But the nexus between economic development and peace was very clear, and that you could not have one excluding the other. And so we had to focus on the two. And that's the way we went about things. Tapped into the agricultural base of the Delta. And following some analysis, look at those ones that had the most significant potential for growth. And then help people who were already players, call them capitalists or whatever. They're already players, but they were using outdated methods to do things. So how can you get those outside the region who have developed better methods and practices to understand the potentials and the opportunities that were there and to come in? And 8 years after, lots more private sector players are coming in there. I'm not going to do free advertisement for anybody here, but most of the biggest names are coming in there and beginning to tap in because there's some semblance of peace and there are potentials for economic growth. I'm not sure if you want me to go into details of what we did now or will you save that for later, but that's just the overarching thing I'd like to mention. But it had to be the two. Efforts to tap into those who were ready to build and walk through conflict resolution systems, while at the same time looking at those who already had economic potentials and then help them to grow.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to the details shortly, but let me speak Tokwe and go to Juliet first. And one of the, if you look at the crisis in the Northeast, a lot of what has been mentioned, the politics, the economics, the religion, the weak governance in terms of development, have all been mentioned as key issues that have triggered this crisis. But one of the major issues that have also triggered this crisis is a feeling of grievance And so when this Boko Haram thing started initially, a lot of people felt aggrieved that they had been, they had been treated unfairly by government, by the system. And a lot of people in the Southeast feel a certain sense of grievance, as far as I know. What has been your experience, Juliet, and how do we try to ensure that this grievance doesn't turn to violence?
Thank you very much. I think I want to start first in talking about the Southeast to say that not just the Southeast, but all parts of Nigeria, feel a certain sense of grievance, if I could borrow that word. And what I see that grievance as is really pain, unresolved pain. And the thing with pain is, it doesn't matter whether it's valid or not valid. It doesn't matter what we interpret it to be. It is the person that feels it that's going to act out. So for us in the Southeast, I think I'm with an organization called the Southeast Society of Professionals. I'm founded by Michael Oreke. And what we're trying to do now is look at things from a preemptive point of view. To not say this is happening in the Northeast or in the Middle Belt and doesn't concern us, right? We're becoming more introspective to say what are the factors that exist in the Southeast now that are bubbling underneath and could, potentially spill over into violence. Identifying the factors and then addressing them, not living in denial anymore. So what we found out so far, like I do a lot of direct engagement with communities and speaking with people one-on-one. Actually, I got on social media at the beginning of the IPOB agitation when that was coming up, because we were already seeing trends. And a group of, people in the Southeast came together to say it's important to study these trends, both internationally and locally, because we have Igbos, living in different parts of the world. And there was a resonating message. And that's important, not just for the Southeast, but even for the rest of Nigeria. And it's this issue of leadership living in denial. We have a crisis. We have a reactionary response to it, but we don't address the root causes. And so it is not uncommon to have something like the Biafran War, which happened 50 years ago, now having a resurgence. And if you take that, it means that even Boko Haram, that what we're seeing today, if we don't address the root causes, decades from now, I keep saying the great-grandchildren of the people that you don't resolve their issues are going to start having a conversation that you're wondering where did that come from. So how do we address this? Number one, we need these types of conversations. We need conversations that are difficult, that are meaningful, but are brutally honest. So in the Southeast, we need to bridge a gap that exists, and that comes back again to this nexus, this idea of a meeting point, of connecting, because what's happening in Nigeria now is there's a disconnect at different levels. There's a disconnect from the leadership, from government, from the people that they're leading. There's a disconnect even within demographics. So in the Southeast, there's a disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation. And it's ironic because it's the older generation that actually experienced the Civil War, right? But for the younger generation, they are now coming up, a number of them coming up to say, okay, we want our own country. But that for me is like a metaphor. You want something new when what you have existing is not working for you. It's a human thing, just like Boko Haram. When those kids, when they started enlisting them, when they started the whole, the ideology, so to speak, nobody questioned at the beginning, what is it about their current reality that it's so terrible that they'd rather go with an alternate one, even if it means blowing themselves up in the process. So it's that conversation that we're lacking. And what we've decided to do is to say, let's study everything that's happening in Nigeria. Let's go back to our history, because for a pretty long time, we kind of like lived in denial. Let's go back to look at the same issues, like the Civil War, for instance. Look at it from different perspectives, not just as victims or victor, but as Nigerians. That a war is something that fractures a nation, and a nation has to heal from it. And if it doesn't, and after that you have series of military incursions into the governance space, you militarize the people. And when you militarize the people, and then say 1999, you transfer to a democracy, you just have people that are more or less like mimics of the military. So the politicians, you're getting people that are also oppressing people, keeping people impoverished, you know, a lot of corruption, a lot of ineptitude. And again, that militarized mindset that was bubbling underneath, in a democratic space, it finds room to express itself. Under the military, people couldn't talk. People couldn't, you know, show they were angry, right? Now in a democratic space, and with the advent of social media, it democratizes everything. Communication is now free for all. So people are angry. Some people don't even know why they're angry. If you're on social media, you would experience this. You say something, and then people just come at you. Until we pause to have the conversations, to say, okay, I don't know why you're angry, but I need to listen to you. And that's what we're doing. I've been engaging different communities in Canada, in the UK, even here in Nigeria. When IPOP started, people just dismissed them to say, oh, these kids don't know what Biafra is about. You know, they're being led astray. They're, you know, trying to ferment trouble. But then my challenge was, if this many number of people are locking into an ideology, why is no one sitting down to ask them, what are the real issues? Because there's always the surface presenting problems, but then there are the real root issues. There's the economic issue, like you mentioned. Unemployment is a huge factor. The fact that people cannot aspire the way, self-actualization, right? You want a space where you can dream, where you can, if you're qualified for something, you get access to it. So if those things are lacking, then people are going to cling onto whatever ideologies come their way, whatever is loudest. So the conversation we are having now is to become the dominant voice, where the voice is not saying let's go to war or let's have our own country, or rather let's listen to what the issues are. What are the points, things that are breaking down or have broken down in Nigeria that we need to fix? There are many of them. We know these things, from education, social justice, healthcare, basics, infrastructure. Those things, if they're lacking, you would always have militancy. You would have Boko Haram. You will have, you know, agitators wanting their. You keep manifesting these problems, and then if you add the environmental, you know, problems of climate change and things like that, you have that protracted issue of the herders and you know, headsmen and farmers. So our solution is, it's time for Nigeria to have these type of conversations. And we can have them at the national level like we're doing now, but we also have to go local. We have to go to our communities and have these conversations. We have to go at the regional level and have these conversations. The youth demographic is 65%, going on 70. If we don't engage them to know what they really want, they're living in a different world. It's the fourth industrial revolution. What they want is not what we're offering. And so we need to find out what it is they want and provide it for them.
Thanks very much, Juliet. I'll go next to Tokwe, because Tokwe, the NESG has actually convened very, very important discussions around a lot of these topics that you've mentioned. But like the SSG said, when the technocrat gets into government, he or she is immediately faced with politics. And so you have this tension between political short-termism and intellectualism that can actually solve longer-term problems. You always have this tension between the two. How does the kind of work you've done in the NESG start to tackle some of these issues, and how can we get these kinds of conversations in front of the people that need to hear them?
Thank you. I'm delighted that the SSG found out early enough when he entered office. Politicians who find out late also often find themselves out of office. At the root of all the issues we're talking about, there are just two words: political economy. And we have found at the NESG that when we approach these debates, when we approach these issues without, first of all, seeking to understand the political economy surrounding decision-making, surrounding how things play out, that we get stuck in those conversations. And as the SSG pointed out, that there is no collaboration. I was expecting him to initially identify that even within government, there is no collaboration. So we have various ministries who are supposed to work together, and they don't talk to one another. We speak about unemployment, and most of the things we are facing in Nigeria today, the root cause is people are jobless. Give people room for self-expression, then the political tension goes down. But when you have an education ministry that is not talking to the Ministry of Labor and Employment, and the Labor and Employment Ministry that does not even realize its employment mandate, they are not speaking to science and technology in a society with 65% youth population. So what we've experienced when we engage with them in trying to get things done is we see a lot of these silos, and we see money going down the drain, and we see limited impact. We then said we will go beyond making recommendations to embed ourselves into the implementation process. So it's a World Bank PPD procedure that we adopted, public-private sector dialogue. So we keep having dialogues, but it's time to translate the dialogues into action. And from the get-go, yes, we are faced with the decision-making. Political tenure of any office holder is 2 years. The first year, we are paying political debts. Then we have 2 years to work. And the last year is active politicking ahead of the next election. So when we get into those conversations with them, we try to create the kind of structures that will have the private sector representation at that table. We know that some of these conversations will take 10 years. We would work with this minister today. It will be another one tomorrow. When the new person comes, we go back. And we say, here was where we stopped. And I can point to examples that we are beginning to concession railways today. That journey started in 2007, when we started the process of wanting to amend the legislation. There was a law that prohibited private investment into railways, and we didn't have any capacity sitting in government to manage that process. These are issues we face when we look at investment. There is no nation that can industrialize successfully without infrastructure such as railways and electricity. And without industrialization, a high population economy cannot absorb all the people coming into the market. Structural issues. We started working on it. It took us 10 years. We've had 2 terms of people in the Senate within that time, but we got it done. every process that we get involved in now, we try to create a structure where, yes, we will slightly, because of the political economy bit, we will slightly allow the politicians to have the short-term photo opportunities that seem to dominate. We will then force the agenda to include mid-term and long-term objectives, so that as we give them something, we know we are also working on a longer-term framework. And I think that what we need in this instance is a situation where we can have the private sector as a participant in this conversation. Development agencies may not be able to say a few things to people in government the way we can have those conversations, but if we are sitting at the table and we know the long-term objectives and we are committed to achieving, we are happy to take a few detours along the way, but eventually going back and going back and going back and focusing on those same issues. Lastly, I also agree with you. I've had it several times that the challenge is implementation, that there is no shortage of plans. I've seen a few of the plans too, and I am worried. To just put it mildly, I am worried. So that also requires tweaking before we then, but we've got to do everything side by side. As we're tweaking those, we're also working to implement some. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's actually a good place to start. And what I want to do, or rather to go next, what I want to do is to take, for each panel member, to take 1 minute, basically to talk about how we can get a plan that actually works. And then I want to go to the audience. I'll take a few questions from the audience if anybody has any questions before we close. But let me start with you again, Tokwe. So how do we get a plan that works? How do we get a mutual accountability framework that actually works? 1 minute.
A multi-stakeholder platform, donor community, government, private sector, a mapping exercise to understand the complexity of the problem, and an action plan that we all commit to. Commitment will be in varying levels, but that's fine. That's the nature of these things. But once we have those three parties and we have a plan that we commit to, then two of the parties at least can collaborate together to force the hand of the third party. And I won't mention which party is which, I think we all know. So that we can transition between governments and still be working on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Juliet, how does the community particularly get involved in this accountability framework? How do they participate in setting the agenda? How do they participate in monitoring the results and reporting the outcomes?
The key thing for participation at the community level, I think, is taking ownership. For too long, the apathy has existed. There's been a breakdown of trust, right? But we can no longer afford to have those excuses anymore. So citizens at the community level, you know, be it grassroots, you know, middle class, it doesn't matter. The apathy has just got to stop. If we want change, we have to be willing to engage. We have to be willing to participate. We have to be willing to get on that table, even if we're not invited, to come into the room. Yeah, we have to be willing. There's no room anymore, you know, to say they're doing this to us. It's poor leadership. It's poor this. It's poor that. It's now all of us. And I specifically want to speak to the elite class to say the apathy has just got to stop. It has to. Get involved. However you're going to do it, get involved. And on a quick note, there's something it's a burning issue. I want to just quickly speak to it, and it's about police reforms. There are key things that we can do that can jumpstart a lot of things. Education reforms and police reforms are two critical areas. Youths are speaking out on social media, offline. They're saying reform Nigerian police. That's something that's bubbling under. I don't want to have a situation where that bubbles over into violence, because it's coming and we can stem that now. So to the President, to the National Assembly, reform the Nigerian police. It's about time. And prioritize education. It's about time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Incidentally, I was at a TV program last night where they were talking about the tension between the National Assembly and the executive, and you know, the senator was there, he was very angry. The attorney general was there, was very angry. And they were talking about, you know, people overstepping bounds. And the most calm person on the panel was the policeman. Probably the most experienced when it comes to overstepping bounds. But but how do we ensure that any framework we have going forward doesn't become another Niger Delta master plan that the governors actually don't feel ownership of, and whose development planning is not actually in sync with that master plan? Tunji.
Thank you. One of the things we do at the Foundation for Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta is to have an annual forum, which is one where we bring all the stakeholders, government, private sector, development, and all that. So last year's edition was focused on development planning, a state-based planning, a framework that could be helpful, because we found out that a lot of the states, once administrations changed, they just got jettisoned. But Cross River had brought us in, along with CUSO and a few other partners, where we started working with them for something that is bottoms up. Most times, state governors and state governments sit down, come up with a wish list of what they think is okay, and then they think they will implement them in the communities. No ownership. But what we did in Cross River that was very neat was it involved every section of society, and it was then backed up. I'm not sure they passed it yet, but the legislature was a big champion in that respect. And so from the grassroots, people were able to buy into that. And the whole idea is that when administrations change, because it becomes enacted, it won't be at the whims and caprices of whoever is in the corner office. But the other thing that would help, back to what Juliet was saying, is for about 5 years now, we instituted a capacity building program that was targeted at civil society in the Niger Delta. Knowing that these guys are right there in the communities dealing with their folks, but they lacked capability compared to folks, their counterparts in maybe the Southwest and other places. And so you've taken them through a multi-year curriculum where they can strengthen themselves in certain areas. And now when you hear things about open budgeting, it's because some of these guys have become involved in that, and so states are now putting things on the web, and these guys can be involved in monitoring. A number of them also got involved in, they're going to help monitor the strategic implementation work plan for the Niger Delta, which involves a lot of infrastructure things from the various ministries out there. That is one way to make sure this happens. Steve from USAID is there. We co-sponsor a program, strategic advocacy for civic engagement. We take care of the Niger Delta piece. This is also to equip the civil society folks with how to engage the legislature and other arms of government and begin to lobby. And the NGO bill was one where a lot of them really showed what they had learned over time. This is some of the ways that we need to have this happen. You've got to tap into civil society, but it won't be intuitive. You've got to invest in building their capacity, because at the end of the day, there'll be allies to speak and also allies to keep those of us in public office accountable.
Thank you very much. I think we've punished Ayaz enough for having taken time to do a presentation before the others spoke. But I thought it was a very, very informative presentation. It's always good to learn what has happened in other places and how it's been tackled, because I know that another usual refrain is that everything happens only in Nigeria. Of course, it doesn't. So having listened to the discussions around the panel, what do you think we can take from this approach in Somalia to try to address the challenges we have here? And I'll be very generous and give you 2 minutes instead of 1.
Thank you very much. No, I mean, actually, we actually started this work in Nigeria first and took it to Somalia. So and then it's just that the pace of progress has been faster there, you know. But the way I see it, like the fellow panelists have talked a lot about the structural issues, the longer term issues, which are extremely important. But what we also need to remember, perhaps, is that recovery is the distance between humanitarian response and regular development. And to cover that's an incremental distance that can be covered very gradually. It cannot happen overnight. So while we need to address the structural drivers and we need to do it simultaneously, there is a need to focus on the immediate challenge of how to address recovery. And for me, the government of Nigeria, together with the states, developed what is called about 2 years back a recovery and peace building assessment, which covers all sectors, which includes sector recovery strategies, discussed threadbare with all the states, and have come up with plans based on that. It's a matter of now implementing those plans. We don't need to like reinvent the wheel, it's already there. And so what we have been doing over the last year and a half is trying to see how we can find that framework approach to implement the RPPA, and we're getting there. All it requires, in my view, right now, there are programs that are already ongoing. For example, we're working closely with the African Development Bank and Islamic Bank on a joint partnership framework to make sure that whatever projects we are doing are aligned with each other. That's all that needs to be done. Make sure that Tom is not constructing the school that I'm trying to construct, and it goes down to such simple levels. What we've also tried to use is a model of what we call nodes of convergence. So what under the proposed model, all development projects, all humanitarian projects converge at a central state level institution, so that we know who's doing what. This is, in other words, this approach has been practiced the world over. It's called the programmatic approach to recovery rather than the projectized approach. The projectized approach means Tom does his own project, I do my own project, and we don't talk. But programmatic approach means that we are talking to each other, but not just talking to each other, but we are actually creating systems that help us do that. So a system for joint monitoring and evaluation of results. A system for joint prioritization and sequencing. Another thing that we have done after the RPPA, the government has done, is prioritize these further into what can be done immediately. RPPA came up with a recovery plan that the cost of which is about $6 billion. No one has that money, but we have enough to at least start. About $1.5 billion in development money. So that's what I would try to stress is let's start. Let's not wait. Let's start. And there are little things that can be done by improving coordination at the state level, by improving, having these joint performance management systems up and running, and then for the federal government, obviously, is the final node of convergence. That's where all the state results converge together. So that's the very simple model. It looks simple when I say, but it's not, to operationalize it requires, the endorsement of the highest level of government, but it requires the will and the institutional manpower to be able to do it. And so we need to start focusing on building those capacities for coordination and getting on with, the business of providing at least immediate support to the people of Northeast Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I go to the final person, the SSG, how are we going to moderate the questions? Do we have microphones out there? We do. Okay. So let me just go finally to the SSG, and then we'll take a couple of questions and we'll close. SSG, when you were talking, you talked about how good it would have been if the 6 states of the Northeast had actually come together earlier on and thought about the looming challenges and try to plan towards them. I know that a number of regional commissions around the country are beginning to give some thought to this. The Southwest Regional Development Commission, there's one in the Southeast, there's one in the South-South. Is there any such thing in the Northeast that are coming together, to think jointly about the challenges that the region will face and, the possibility of actually putting in place some joint plans to try to address this?
Thank you very much. That's the most interesting part of this nexus. People and governments have to come together positively. There is and there is not. There is because we have a template that we're now trying to sell. And I'll very quickly describe this template. And I've invited Dr. Alakija to come so that we can develop this together. You see, the Northeast is now considered the most dangerous zone in Nigeria. And everybody is advised not to go there. Now, there are 6 states. If you are going to the Northeast by road, you must pass through Jos. So from Jos, when you hit Bauchi, it's a roundabout. And if you go left, you go to Yobe. It's only one road. And you continue on that road, you go to Borno State. It's only the same road. You continue on that road, you come to Adamawa State. You continue on that road from Adamawa State down to Ganye, then you pop out through Taraba. The same road. You hit Numan, you come to Gombe. The same road. And then you come back to the same roundabout in Bauchi. It's only one roundabout. So we said, look, there are 6 governors. Is it so difficult to close your eyes to assume that, look, the way you see this infrastructure, this airport road, 5 lane, 5 lane, is it impossible to construct that road 5 lane, 5 lane, and start thinking Potoskum will be a town, Maiduguri will be a mega city, Yola will be a mega city, Numan will be a huge town? Is it difficult to start thinking this way? And then they started thinking. I said, no, but don't just do road. Because you are agricultural in nature, you are moving large volume of low-value products over long distances. Your overheads alone will not allow you. That is why you are not industrial. So put a railway around this ring so that you can move quickly and cheaply. But don't stop there. Because you are agricultural, you're only doing 6 months rainy season, and the rest of the year you are just sitting under trees resting. Why don't you construct an open canal, irrigation canal, fill it up with water, pumping it around so that you can do 24/7, 365 days agriculture? Then you don't have to move house and you don't have to fight about that. But don't stop there. This is a zone with the longest solar illuminance. We have the Mambila power plant. We have the Kiri Dam. We have so many plants. Why don't you construct also a power transmission line around this roundabout so that you can harvest your power and move the power around to develop your zone? But don't stop there. Bury a fiber optic around that and automate the whole system so that your education, your healthcare. Now, but you see, this is a closed loop. So you start thinking, so what? But you see, the thing is, from the Taraba side, if you pass through Benue, they're also facing challenges. And you pop out in Cross River, and you now join the Northeast to the port in Calabar. And that's it. Nigeria has changed forever. This is now the plan. And we are going to create this nexus by first putting all the 6 governors together, bring a meager 50 million naira each. We have 300 million naira. We can bring global consultants to come and tell us if this plan is possible. If it is possible, then every governor will have a tiny little booklet with bankable proposals. When you go to China, now you know what to say because you have a plan. This is the idea.
Thank you, SRG. As you were speaking, I was tempted to say, and don't stop there. Okay, there's a question at the back. Sorry, just before you continue. Okay. I forgot to set the ground rules. Each person is allowed 2 statements, and the second statement must end with a question mark. Please carry on.
All right. Like I said before, I'm borrowing the word of our friend from the southwest, brutal honesty. In the Delta, there is no peace. Again, I wish to say quickly that the absence of war, absence of conflict, as a result of not such of national assets like oil, does not connect peace. In the last 5 months, we've had several intra-communal conflicts. I will mention one by one, few ones. Emu a bit intra-communal conflict in the last 3 weeks. Ogbujal is persistent. Ayame Epame. We can go on. The worst part of it, even Omadino in Ryden Warri South with 224 oil wells have no drinkable water. Then where is this peace? So there's a lot of conflict in the Delta. I'm not going to the herdsmen because it's almost a national phenomenon. I'm talking about the ones we see. Because if people cannot live together, because like the SSG mentioned from the Adaman State, a lot of communities, look, they are so persistent. So let us not say the Delta have peace. There is serious conflict going on there. Maybe they are not reported, but we are on the ground. As the convener of the Delta State Company Management Alliance, I can tell you I get this information every day. And again, we have persistent secret court issues on and on. Kidnapping is not even ended. We can't see with peace. Now my question.
Oh, right.
How was that a building narrative?
That's a bit like Idi Amin speaking for 7 hours and saying, after those brief comments, that's all you've just done. Okay, ask the question quickly, please.
Yeah, the question is, the national conversation is beyond the Northeast. My question is, how will this plan inculcate or be infused with the plans we have, like you already mentioned, the Niger Delta Master Plan? Thank you. And how will it be applicable to the different states of the Niger Delta? Thank you.
Thank you. Yodi.
I'm really sorry, I'm also breaking your ground rules, but the gentleman just said, how will this plan? With the Nexus right now is not a plan. So I think we're not creating another giant plan. I mean, the minister spoke earlier about a 3-year sort of framework in terms of the humanitarian development, which will encompass the whole country, and that is, okay, that is a plan. But I wanted to just make it very clear that the accountability framework that we're talking about is more about implementation, which you might not have been here when I said earlier, implementation. It's not a plan, not another plan. And so I have no, my question is, may I please give you back the microphone?
Thank you. I'll take a question from the lady at the back, and that will be all. Oh, okay. Okay, I'll come back to you.
I'm very happy with the SSG from Adamawa. I'm so thrilled hearing him. My question is, do you have implementation strategy? And are you backing it up with that political power? When people say we do not implement, or our problem is implementation. Because we have had a lot of beautiful plans like this. Please do not let it die. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman there. There are no protocols. Please carry on.
Done so far. The use of statistics is very, very important in this case. Because I heard us mentioning something about monitoring and evaluation. You cannot monitor by sentences, but we monitor by data. We can monitor it by giving the reports at the end on monthly basis, quarterly basis, and to see the challenges and way forward that we have. This will help our government in policy formulation. You talk about the settlements that are having problems for Nexus, then I am suggesting, not a question, that for us to have full information, it must be on presentation of statistics through a conduct of a survey called multiple indicator cluster survey that will contain all the indicators relevant. For example, on the ages of 0 to 5, 15 to 49, that is women of childbearing age, men as well, even 50 and above, on their health services, living standards, and as well as other things, even demographic characteristics of those people. There we will be able to monitor well, and then advise our government to do something because of the challenges and way forward, sir. Thanks very much. I'm no other person but Thomas E.G. from National Bureau of Statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I should go to Tokwe to talk about some of the issues of, the use of statistics, credible planning, and then I'll come to the SSG because there was a specific question addressed to him.
We don't have dynamic data, and we sympathize with the folks from the National Bureau of Statistics. I think they are being poorly funded. They are not able to carry out the mandate as they should. So as the NESG, we're in the process of setting up a data room to be able to have a dashboard of all the indicators. And it's become very important now because the World Bank is going to launch a Human Development Index in October. And we've seen some of the early indicators, and they are quite scary for Nigeria. I mean, under 5, we are maybe 188 out of 190 in terms of the death of under 5, maternal mortality, infant mortality. Those are issues that we need to track on a regular basis, and we need dynamic data, not static data. So we will put that process. Again, it's a collaboration with the relevant arms of government. And I'd like to also permit me to chip this in for the SSG. We like the plan we have outlined. We know there's a political economy perspective. If there's anything that we can do as the private sector, when you put that railway, you'll see the number of farms that we're coming to establish and the number of people we're coming to employ. So we want to work with you to crystallize that agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tunji, I think you had said that there is peace in the Niger Delta depending on the lens through which you look at it. But I don't know if you want to respond to what the gentleman said or not.
Absolutely correct in one respect, while we were also correct in what we led off with. I did say earlier on that when you talk about conflicts in the Niger Delta, the most prominent one is the ones that are related to the oil sector. But the truth is, based on the data and with all modesty, PIN probably has the most comprehensive database on conflict incidents in the country, and which people subscribe to from all over. There are different types of other things. The most violence in the Delta is actually caused by cult groups. And so you've got you've got communal conflicts, you've got all kinds of things going on there. That's part of what the gentleman is referring to. Those are still going on. And what we did was to tap into the energy of those peace actors, peace agents on the ground, rather than focusing on only the troublemakers. And we facilitated the establishment of a network of the indigenes of the area, and it's called the Partners for Peace Network. They're about 6,000 strong as we speak across all the 9 states of the Delta. These guys monitor developments, send in SMS messages onto a database that we manage, and then from that we coordinate responses and just make sure the appropriate authorities and parties know about those. So he's correct in that regard, but you have these pockets of things that don't get as much attention as the ones that touch the economic life of the country. The other thing is you've got to have folks always we're going to have an infrastructure in place. And we do have a peace and security working group in the Delta, which we also function actively. We actually created it. There's another one here in Abuja, and I'm not sure how well the states of the Northeast are represented, but that's some place to tap into. Lots of agencies that are working together, doing great things, such as Juliet has also mentioned. Lots of folks out there that are engaging communities, preventing in small pockets. Something to tap into. But the Delta does have that, and you have teams responding. As long as partnerships continue to take place, because no single entity can resolve the problems out there. As long as you have those partnerships and you begin to look at them, work with data, and get appropriate stakeholders involved, we can continue to address these and minimize things out there.
Thank you. SHG, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just half a minute. Something told me that this Bureau of Statistics man will be here, so I brought some piece of papers. You see, the thing is, when you look at politics, and you have a governor, for example, or a president, and it was an election run, and majority of the people elected this person, whether it's senator or whatever. But then, 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months or whatever, you start getting the same person being stoned by the same people who elected him. And you tend to wonder, what happened? But you see, on the other side, in Nigeria, we have the traditional system. Only 4 people elect a traditional ruler. They call them the kingmakers. Only 4 people. And that guy will sit on that throne. When he dies, his son will inherit it. So it's so sustained. It's and then they are very, very well respected. Anytime you see a traditional ruler coming, you bow down, you remove your shoes, you greet him, and you never stone traditional rulers. So we said to ourselves, there's something here that can be useful. But do you know the worst part of it? The traditional system in the country is not recognized in the Constitution. They have no role. So what we did, based on statistics, my brother, in Adamawa State, we have 8 major kings, that is the first-class rulers. Below them, we have the district heads, so you have sub-areas, and we have 104 of them. Below the district heads, we have the village heads. There are 718. And below the village heads, we have the ward heads, and there are 7,810. A ward head knows everybody in his ward by name. And you're not using this guy. Somebody will come and start killing people. We will stay for 10 years. Nobody knows. And there's somebody who knows everybody. So what we did, statistically, we listed all these people. There are nearly 10,000 by name. We got their telephone numbers. We got their account numbers, and their BVNs. Then I said to the governor, give those people who knows everybody by name only 5,000 naira per month allowance. The next guys, 10,000 naira allowance. The third village heads, 15,000. Don't worry about the kings. They always get money from here and there. Immediately we started this. It was everybody was jumping up and down. Imagine somebody in the rural area has never seen 2,000 naira, is getting 5,000 naira. But the beauty is that he must have a telephone, so he's getting it by alert, e-payment. So now he's part of the system. He's electronically activated. He's now a modern person. I said, no, you are not yet. So I designed a tool to monitor. So I have pictures. There's a robber. There's 2 people fighting. There's somebody shooting somebody. Something like 40 indices by picture. And I put Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I tell the guy, just pick if there's a fight in your area. I don't need any number or name of person or whatever. So this, my Angwa does this every week. And he takes it to his senior person. He said, look, this is the result of my survey. Just ticks. So the village head will see ticks on fighting. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, there's a fight in this area. So now he has a reason. He has our 10,000 naira per month. He has to go there and say, why are you guys fighting every day? Then you would have pinpointed that young chap who is a drunk, who is on drugs, who doesn't listen to anybody. Then you would pick him easily before he kills anybody. This is statistical, it's proven, it's working. it is on the basis of this that we now put all the political heads, the 3 senators, the 8, everybody, we again documented their names with their telephone numbers. We gave people free. You can call your leader directly, abuse his father if he's not doing well, and praise him if he's doing very well. But we asked them too. We listed all the insecurity challenges that we know, from cattle rustling, kidnapping, whatever. And we asked them, tick in your local government, which ones are more serious? And they tick for us. And then we created a map. Every local government we know. With this, we now looked at, if you look at the local government, we then knew that one of the local governments has 18 over 20, is the most dangerous local government. And then downwards, we knew which of the challenges is most serious. You cannot believe it. In Adamawa State, the most serious is drugs. Nobody's talking about it. The next is youth unemployment. The next is IDP. All is youth. So he directed our government to design a youth empowerment program based on this map. So this is my madam who asked about what are we doing. These plans, politicians, as rough as they can see them, they don't like anything that will bring impeachment. So I'm breaking the law is impeachable. So convert these plans to law. So our own development plan, we send it to the House of Assembly. We beg them, make this into law, but don't tell them that you are making law so that impeachment or whatever. Tell them, anybody who comes after you cannot forget about your programs. It will continue because it's law. So when you get the law, then you start budgeting on the basis of the plan because it's law. And then if anybody budgets out, you say, well, there's impeachment. You can, the conviction of a governor after 10 years is now good for us because we'll say, even after you've left 10 years, they will look for you and they'll lock you up. So these are the technocrat techniques in politics, if you know what I mean. I'm an engineer by training. So I have to gradually penetrate the system in a very careful manner, otherwise you cannot survive. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. My panel has been Ms. Julia Kego. Round of applause, please. Mr. Tokwe Togu from the NESG. Mr. Tunji Dowu from PIND. Mr. Ayaz Pavez from the World Bank. And Dr. Mao Binder, who has again debunked the fallacy that there is no capacity in the Nigerian government. There is plenty of capacity. Thank you very much. Thanks, Yodi.
and experiences from outside of Nigeria, particularly. So to do that, we will have, again, Ayaz Pavez will chair that session, and we'll have, representing the head of OCHA, Alta Hegati will be on that panel, and Mary Morrison will be on that panel, as will Fahad Zishan, who's the Deputy Country Director from Action Against Hunger, who will bring an NGO perspective from other countries, including South Sudan, Pakistan, etc., to the table. So the panelists, if they could begin to prepare themselves to come up as Ayaz finishes being a superstar with paparazzi. let panel 2 begin. Afternoon session 2. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can just please settle down so that the panelists can begin.
So can we all please settle down a bit? We're just going to start another session. The session is called Learning Lessons on Conflict and Recovery, Humanitarian Response from Other Countries. And we might as well also speak a little bit about the experience in Nigeria itself so far. So I'm going to quickly request the panelists to please introduce themselves, and then we can get on with it. So.
Thank you very much, Ayaz. My name is Alta Bell, and I'm with the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs here in Nigeria.
I'm Mary Morrison. I arrived quite recently to Abuja to be coordinator for our program for the Northeast. And in my previous role, I worked in the Central Unit on Fragility, Conflict and Violence. So I'll be speaking partly from the perspective of the country initiatives that have been supported from that unit on the humanitarian development piece Nexus.
Good evening. My name is Fahad Zishan. I'm the Deputy Country Director for Action Against Hunger. I'll try to provide the perspective from other side externally and also from in Nigeria as well, because I've been here for more than almost 3 years. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do to start this session is to invite Dr. Yodi to join me in presenting a little thinking on the new way of working, and so as to really set the pace and the kind of agenda for this quick session. Can you put on the presentation again, please? You put me on the spot, I put you on the spot, yeah? Just go to the last slide, please. One after that, yeah. So, on the first day of this very interesting, exciting event, in the youth session, Dr. Yodi started by drawing a sketch, and it was then that I discovered that not only is she very articulate, she's also a graphic thinker like me, So he was trying to explain to the youth what the nexus means, We have had several definitions of the nexus over the last 2-3 days. I'm sure we'll get even more. But from the perspective of Dr. Yodi, I think the way she described it, it was really a kind of a process. And so we worked a little bit on that chart, and I also added a little bit of the experience from other countries, and that's to set the tone of how this nexus can happen or is happening. So I'd also request the panelists to frame their answers in the context of this particular new way of working and where we are with that. So over to you, Dr. Yodi.
Thank you, Ayaz. I really usually prefer to just draw this, because as I draw, I speak, so I don't know this model. But as Ayaz said, this is actually a map that I have been drawing. Those of you who've been here and part of this for the last 3 years will know that from the very beginning, I would always draw this sketch. If anybody ever came to the ECC, I would always draw out this sketch with humanitarian on one axis, development on the next. And the explanation that I had, and I'm going to walk over to it if I can reach, was that if you, well, this is the nexus, and that's what Ayaz has just described, but that if within a crisis response, you start humanitarian, I actually typically go from the top. So you start humanitarian, you're trying to get to the bottom of that, and you get to somewhere a longer time scale, sort of maybe 18 years at the very end. If you start development early enough, you can avoid long-term sort of almost situations that we have in various other countries that I don't really want to mention. I think we'll hear some of them now. But if you start development there, in a steep curve, you may come to that nexus maybe here, with humanitarian going down. And so you would have caught it maybe within 10 years. If you start development slowly, on a slope, what happens is you maybe meet humanitarian there, and your nexus is 18 to 20 years away. What does that mean? It means there's a lot more cost. I mean, humanitarian assistance is costly. It means that we haven't dealt with peaceful solutions. It means there's a lot more fragility within the context that we're working in. And I want to explain, I think that the experts of the panel will explain more, that what we're looking at there is contextual. So where that nexus comes in Nigeria is different to where the nexus comes in Somalia or South Sudan, and that's why we wanted to hear external perspectives today. Where it comes in Adamawa is very different to where it comes in Borno, or where it comes in Yobe, or where it comes in the Niger Delta, which we've just heard earlier. So that's my little graphic. How did I do? Tormentor.
No, thank you so much, Jyoti. So I thought, the way Dr. Jyoti drew it originally, the nexus, the humanitarian curve going down gradually, the development curve going up gradually, and meeting at some point. Probably the traditional model, but where we are now moving, at least the thinking that is evolving on the new way of working is a single curve model instead of a dual curve model, which essentially means that we are, but imagine that there's a crisis and you start, the humanitarian response, the green line over here. Unfortunately, it's not very visible, but we'll be able to share it later. And at some point, without waiting for the humanitarian response to be over, we start the blue line, which is the development curve, or you would call it the recovery curve. How do you start recovering? And what you do in the green curve, and that's what I've learned from the UN response in many countries recently, is they're also trying to build elements of resilience into the humanitarian operation. And I would very much like, Alta, to you to also bring out that dimension of the humanitarian response. Similarly, development can start being based on the experiences of the humanitarian response and gradually move towards where the actual convergence happens, as Dr. Jyoti was saying much earlier than in the other model. And from there onwards, it's a relatively smooth model where humanitarian operations continue simultaneously with recovery operations. And that's what I call the new way of working, particularly in evolving crisis. In crisis which refuses to go away, we do not have the option of waiting for the crisis to be over, but start acting quickly. So given this background, Alta, I think I've already framed the question, but please do take us through your experiences in other countries, in Nigeria also, on the humanitarian response, but with a view to seeing how the new way of working is manifested in the way that the UN has been working, and how you've been working together with the government, actually.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ayaz. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to say a few words about the humanitarian side. I've had experiences in other humanitarian contexts, including in Sudan, when Sudan and South Sudan were still together, and during the split. And then I've more recently had experience in Somalia, and so I have some understanding of the presentation that Ayaz gave us earlier, where things were getting off the ground in that regard. And now I've been here in Nigeria for 1 year. And it was an interesting time to come last year because everyone in the humanitarian community was very much cognizant of the need to scale up. And we are working with the government with a humanitarian response plan that had increased to $1 billion. Well, 1.05 billion. And last year, I think as the year got going, we had something like a few hundred humanitarian actors. But by the year end, we were looking at more than 3,000 humanitarian actors. We looked at a situation where there was a concern of a potential famine. We saw a serious humanitarian crisis that emphasized food insecurity and a serious protection issue with respect to people who are being affected by the conflict. The humanitarian community, the donors, the government, everyone really put a lot of effort into raising the awareness of the seriousness of the situation. There was an incredible, generous response by the donors that there was over $900 million raised, 700, I think, and 40 million against the humanitarian response plan. And we saw a year where we saw the capacity scale up. We saw a year where we saw famine averted. For those of you who are in the food security discussions this week, we also saw major changes in terms of food security levels, from serious crisis levels to something that I think is in the orange. There's, from red to orange, those phases, those scales. So where does that put us this year? Well, here we are going into 2018, or actually we're halfway through practically. And we have a humanitarian response plan that is requesting the same amount of money, $1.05 billion. But we're actually recognizing, there are opportunities here. There are famines averted. There are real, there's progress made. But at the same time, we have 7.7 million of affected people. We have 6.1 that are targeted for humanitarian assistance. And at the moment, that's only going to change if these people are no longer going to be dependent on humanitarian assistance. And this is why the Nexus is so important. This is why we need to work together really carefully right now, really closely right now, and try to change that dynamic. And we have a real opportunity. And in addition, Nigeria has been seen as a country that will be a pilot country for the Nexus. There's major international commitment to the Nexus, as well as to Nigeria in this regard. So let me just pause and say a few things about what my experience has been in other countries and the challenges that I think were experienced and things that we should take into account here. In Sudan, in Darfur, when I arrived in 2009, we were several years into a crisis where we had, and by the time I left, people who were in IDP camps for more than 10 years. And a lot of those were settled around major towns. And throughout, the government was really encouraging returns. We were trying to ensure that there were opportunities for voluntary returns. But the conflict was continuing. And people didn't want to return because of insecurity. There were other ideas. Well, how can we resettle people where they are, actually? Can we turn these into, settlement towns? Can we create model villages? How can we get people to go back? And ultimately, they always said the biggest issue that was preventing them from going back was security, insecurity, conflict, fear. We know that the conflict is still full on going in the Northeast. And security is a critical issue if we're going to be able to move ahead in this Nexus. And this is where obviously we need to work closely also with the government on these issues. The other thing they said that they wanted, especially those who had been living in these IDP camps for 10 years, where the children were no longer used to the farming lives, etc., but now the families became used to having essential services like health clinics and education and so on. And it was all about, well, how do we go back to these villages if we don't have those services, and what investment was there going to be on the part of the government or the international community, development community, to help with that? Well, first, it wasn't really happening in any great way because, people weren't returning because of the security at that time, insecurity, that is. By the same token, we were still relying on humanitarian funding. There was not development money going in any significant way in Darfur. And I remember one statistic that surprised me when I first arrived, that something like 70% of the essential basic services throughout Darfur were being paid for through humanitarian funds. And it was around that time where resilience became a very interesting concept. And a number of the donors were looking at consortia and trying to find ways of building resilience. But I think the big challenge was getting development money to come in through the government and whether things were secure enough to be able to do that and take it forward. I'll just say a few words now about Somalia, because I think it was interesting going there with the new government in place and the National Action Plan, or the National Plan for development there, that we were working closely with them on. And when I say we, I'm talking about the international community, the humanitarian, but mostly the development. And then, you know, the World Bank was coming in. We were all looking at how do we work together. We were using words like resilience then. But the other one that we were using predominantly was durable solutions. And so, okay, here we are, humanitarians. We're working in all these IDP locations. There are different efforts to try to turn them into settlements. The big challenge there seemed to be around land rights, housing and land rights. And what would happen is these IDP camps or settlements would go in. We'd be putting in place all of these different basic services, et cetera. And then after things got built up and we put in temporary housing, we were trying to make it a more durable situation. The landowners would come in, they would push out the IDPs, and then they would actually, you know, benefit from the land that they had put in place the different services. So then we had to, you know, support the IDPs in other locations. But what was my point? I'm getting off point, because what I really wanted to talk about was we were working with the Nigeria Humanitarian Fund, and the Somalia Humanitarian Fund, sorry. And we had this idea of multi-sector funding for IDP locations that were going to catalyze durable solutions. There was a recognition that there was a lot of humanitarian funding that had gone in over the years, and that we should look at that as almost like an investment, because, you know, each year we put in new funding for temporary things, and we never, if you look back on 10 years and what you've invested in humanitarian response that could have actually had so much more impact, you really begin to think, and this is the same case for Sudan, it's like we're really losing out here. But the big problem then in terms of catalyzing was that passing the baton and having the right kind of planning processes so that the development and the humanitarian partners could work together, the funding streams could work together, and we could actually really make a difference. We still had the housing issues to deal with. We still needed to work through those things, but there could have been those opportunities. I think there's more of them now there in Somalia, so I'm happy to hear about that. I was just going to conclude. So I think my conclusion was that, you know, talking about what we have in the last few days, about the funding streams, about the joint planning and analysis, and joint programming, these are all the new way of working. And actually really working together to make that happen, to action that, is the challenge we had to have ahead of ourselves. And I think we have some really interesting opportunities here in Nigeria, and we have to work very closely with the government. We have to put all of those pieces in the different layers that they need to be, from communities to state level to national level, all of those things. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. That was extremely insightful, particularly comparing the countries across, you know. So I'm going to come back to you, and actually I'm going to, after Mary and Fahad, we're going to just open up, and I'm going to ask two questions, and you know, everyone who's here in this room should feel free to not only ask questions, but actually give us your thoughts about this fundamental question. So how can we make this work? What is the biggest challenge in your view, and what needs to be done to address it? You know, so that's going to be the theme question after we hear from Mary and Fahad. So Mary, I think Alta has been talking a lot about the humanitarian development part, but she also mentioned the importance and centrality of security and peace. So maybe it would be good for you, since you also, I know, work in a lot in that area, to, while reflect on your experience experiences in other countries also bring in the peace element to see how the centrality of peace is to be ensured, and what is it that we can do within our domains, because we are not security players, to link up better with security and make this happen. But feel free to share other experiences also.
Hello. Thank you very much, Ayaz. And it's quite appropriate that I'm following Alta here, because much of what the World Bank has really the humanitarian development piece, Nexus, has been in very close collaboration with the UN, and obviously with the governments that we fund around the world. I'm going to actually look at this from two sort of perspectives. One is the kind of the bigger picture of what are we really doing with humanitarian development and peace actors on the ground, the global picture, and then talk a little bit about a very specific initiative that the World Bank and the UN have run for a couple of years to support the kinds of things we've been talking about in the last couple of days, of coordination structures and joint frameworks, all very much in support of the new way of working, and just draw some specific lessons from that, because while these pilots have come from other countries, some of them I think are probably helpful in the Nigerian context, as we do start thinking about what does it really mean to take all of our good resolutions and big statements forward. Okay, so on the sort of the bigger picture, as Rashid, our country director, mentioned in his comments this morning, the World Bank's kind of the real imperative for the World Bank to work more effectively with humanitarian and peace actors really comes from this big shift in our funding, first and foremost. It started about a year ago, what we call IDA 18, the new round of IDA, which is the major source of concessional financing in the World Bank, essentially doubled the funding that needs to be spent in what we call environments of fragility, conflict and violence, FCV. This is a lot of money we're talking about. Overall, the numbers went from around 9 billion to around 18 billion for a 3-year period for fragile settings. Much of this was because the sort of core allocations for countries doubled, but then there are also a number of special funding windows, one of which I'll talk about in particular, because it, I think, provides a good overview of how we work on the practical implementation of these resources at a country level, which is really what this panel is supposed to be focusing on. So I'll talk a little bit about the refugee window, the full name of which is actually, I think, let's see if I can get this right, the Regional Sub-Window for Refugees and Host Communities. And this has about $2 billion of resources in it for 3 years. And how this has involved, closer work with humanitarian agencies, and particularly the UN, in fact, in support of national governments. The World Bank previously really did not do a whole lot of work on support of refugees. This was seen as very much a humanitarian issue. But I'm sure we've all seen, we've heard a number of figures over the last few days of, the typical length of a humanitarian situation. And there were some numbers that came out, I think, last year of the average refugee as a refugee for something like 16 or 17 years. So there was an increasing recognition in the World Bank that this needed longer-term, development approaches to it. And how really the partnership has worked in terms of this has been, I think, number one, joint analysis and planning quite upstream. I'll talk a little bit about the Lake Chad Basin, because this obviously is directly related, to northeast Nigeria and issues there. Because, of course, many of the forced displacement issues of the Lake Chad Basin are direct spillover. I mean, this is Nigerians we're talking about. So there was a joint assessment that was done between the World Bank and UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, in, I think it was 2016 actually, it was over those 2 years, that really looked at, brought sort of the aspects that the World Bank brings, which are the sort of, it was an assessment not just of numbers and needs, but also of impacts, of social and economic impacts, to lead towards essentially recommendations for governments of the region to do more, with a much more longer-term development focus. So this is one piece of work in the background. Then recently, because where the World Bank comes in on the refugee situation is not on the relief side. We don't work on camps. We don't provide immediate assistance. But where we really come in, and this is back to the title of this window, is in helping host communities and in actually helping the government authorities of the receiving countries. So it's been a very close partnership, largely with UNHCR, because the tasks are very complementary. We have done, obviously we focus on providing funding to the governments that are receiving these people. A lot of support goes to the municipal level to include the expansion of government services, schools, healthcare facilities. Much goes into, community mobilization, this kind of thing, to make sure that communities' own needs are being addressed and that they do not feel that they are being disadvantaged by the arrival of these people. And again, it's all very directly being implemented with UNHCR. UNHCR doesn't tend to be, we don't tend to sort of transfer funds to them, but in others of these situations that we have been talking about, that there's been if we think of that as two of the big parts, which is the complementary activities, different parts of the puzzle, and the upstream sort of planning and assessment. Obviously, Aya's already mentioned this recovery and peace building assessment idea, which we've already worked on together for Northeast Nigeria, as well as Cameroon, as well as now several other countries. But there's also a very direct role that comes down to the implementation, which has been much more with, as was mentioned in Aya's presentation earlier. We've done this in other countries across Africa as well, particularly with, recently there have been good examples with World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, of the UN, where they have implemented under contract to governments, these programs of very early recovery. As we've already touched on in Aya's presentation, part of this big switch for the World Bank, driven in part by this funding, but also by, an understanding of the way that the fragility and conflict are manifesting and changing. We are going into situations much earlier where there is even more limited possibility for either direct government implementation, or for other alternatives. So there are increasing cases of UN agencies and other international organizations, NGOs, implementing World Bank funds in these areas. Okay, so turning to from the big picture to the very specific. In 2016, after the World Humanitarian Summit, which has been talked about quite a bit, because this was really the root of this new way of working, which was largely a UN agreement, but the World Bank and a couple of other partners also endorsed this. And following that, the World Bank and the UN, got together to really figure out what we could do in terms of pretty small support. What was really needed at a country level. The kind of thing of what will we come out of this discussion here tomorrow that really needs support to get these frameworks and get this dialogue continued and get this coordination going. And so the question was really put out to a number of World Bank and UN teams in, I think it was a total of 7 pilot countries: Somalia, which Aya's already talked a bit about, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Guinea-Bissau, Sudan, Pakistan, and Yemen. And I hope I said that fast enough that if it doesn't hold up to count up to 7, you'd realize, but I think that's most of them. But so these were pretty small grants, all around, $500,000, really with the aim of supporting, these core elements of what does it mean to first one, job has been hugely important. Bottom up and come from a really concrete, identified local need. But then also, point number 3, that they need to be upward looking. Nothing is sustainable, nothing will be expanded, nothing will endure unless it is really looking upwards to national strategic frameworks and national leadership. Okay, and point number 4 is that all of this stuff, the developing of these frameworks, the coordination, the partnership, can take a lot of time, and reading through the lines, this wasn't what was formally written in the report, but frankly be a complete pain. But it is worth the effort. This, you know, the appointing dedicated staff to really focus on the while needs a lot of attention, a lot of attention national really
I think going on to you've not heard the question. It's the same perspective. It also is a level of try to bring in a little